So, to frame the discussion a bit, many of you are familiar and or part of the Intentional Endowment Network's Net Zero Steering Committee and Net Zero Initiative, which really sought to and still seeks to guide endowments and provide a lot of resources to help endowments, foundations, investors invest for net zero within their portfolios. And as part of that initiative, we created a subcommittee to try and understand what does climate justice look like when we're talking about net zero. Because here you have an opportunity to create the roadmap for how folks will think about net zero for many years. And oftentimes when you have these conversations, the diversity comment or the racial equity comment is something that's kind of tagged on at the end. And so we wanted to view it from the beginning. And so part of that initiative was we researched and developed a paper called Leading with Justice, Net Zero and Conversations on Climate Justice, which takes you from the very, very research-based to the very, very practical on what that actually looks like. It was informed by conversations with a number of practitioners in the field on why climate justice is not only a moral cause, but really an efficient tool for reaching net zero and other environmental goals. And so, with that sort of in mind, and thinking to our esteemed panel today, I wanted to start with you, Mark, because your work at Carbon Tracker sort of positions you right in the center of the net zero conversation. So, you've spoken to how we're in the middle of a very fast economic transition. And what does that actually look like, and what are some of the implications?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, to get to net zero, we obviously have to get off the use of fossil fuels pretty quick. And the rough figures are that we have to cut emissions by 50% within 10 years to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming of our pre-industrial levels. That's a huge shift, huge shift. We've got about $30 trillion worth of fixed infrastructure, gas-fired, or gas-fired power stations, coal-fired power stations, all that structure. And dismantling that is no mean task. It's what we replace it with that we need to be thinking about. And what I'm conscious of is the benefits to communities. You know? I'm thinking of the global south as well as the global north. Across communities of building a system which is actually cheaper than the system we've got at the moment. So those of you who've been following what's been happening in Europe, we're paying £325 a megawatt hour for gas-fired power. We're paying £45 a megawatt hour for renewables. Now that's a huge saving that's going to go to communities once we build out a clean energy system. And the way it's measured is pounds in the pocket. The clean energy transition is inherently deflationary. Just think about fossil fuels for 1 minute. We dig it out of the ground, if it's a tar sand, we boil it up, we put it in the pipeline, we then refine it, we then send it to the other side of the world, and we're going to do the same with gas, except we have to fix it into compressed, then we're going to have to decompress it, send it to a gas-fired power station, and after we burnt it, you have to take out the CO2. Hugely expensive, and yet we're told that this is the only energy system we can have. The great thing about renewables is it's free. The sunlight and wind is free. I don't know how, I use this analogy before, you have to excuse me. How many of you at home have got a printer? The printer ink is more expensive than the printer. When you buy a printer, what you're doing is you're buying a contract to buy printer ink. The fossil fuel system is exactly the same. Once you've bought your car, or a power station, what you're actually doing is buying dependency. That's what you bought. You depend on your ink to print, you depend on the gas for your car. But once you've got electricity from your roof, and you've got a ground source or an air source heat pump, all of this is for free. And this is the upside story of the just energy transition that we have to be talking about. It cuts the cost. Now, 8 of the 10 of the world's population live in energy importing countries. And when we hear about, dare I say, if I can put it like this, within Africa, Africa wants fossil fuels. What you actually need is 6 countries within a continent of over 50 countries have fossil fuels. They want to export their fossil fuels to other African countries. In the same way that Russia and America want to send, and the Middle East want to send their fossil fuels to poor countries. The answer to dealing with justice is to get off of fossil fuels and then build community-level infrastructure that essentially gives us a free energy system.
So staying with you for a second, Mark, because that's an interesting point there. When you talk about community-level infrastructure and how different populations are affected, you have shared that different sectors of the economy may face different outcomes as we're approaching this transition. And so for the non-economists in the room, can you remind us about the three-sector model and how it may be useful in considering the implications of the transition?
Yeah, okay, just very quickly, yeah, I did work in fund management history and I did train as an economist, but, okay, so there's your primary production, you rip stuff out of the ground, that's the primary activity. Secondary is processing, what you've got, and tertiary is services industries. Now let's be clear, the energy transition is going to hit the primary sector of the economy. So about a quarter of the world's equity markets is linked to the fossil fuel system, shipping, aviation, cement, steel, oil and gas, and about half of the corporate bond market is linked to the fossil fuel system. This is what gets turned over. But who gets whacked first is people who produce fossil fuels, and then those who directly use it. I'm thinking coal-fired power and gas and oil. This is what changes. And when we build a net zero portfolio, there's going to be winners and losers. The divestment movement clearly is exiting a sector that is dying. That's what's happening. It's a sector that is dying. You're exiting it, and you're exiting it for financial reasons as well as moral and ethical reasons. But the sector that we need to support are communities working in steel, that's going to have to go to green steel, and sectors as workforces in cement, which is crucial to the economy, and the same with shipping. But shipping is going to change. Half of the global shipping fleet, just think about it for a minute, what does it do? What it's doing is tankers full of oil and gas around the world. Once you no longer have a fossil fuel system, we're going to lose half of the shipping in the global economy. There's only so many holidays you can take in a liner with a swimming pool on the top. There's only so many of those. Most of it is shipping goods and shipping oil and gas. So these sectors are going to change within the next 10, 20 years. What you want is a portfolio manager who can differentiate between all of these. I mean, we're told, do a carbon footprint, do a temperature warming test of your portfolio, set near zero goals. You know, maybe we should do all of those things, but let's get to some basics. If you're in your house and you're ripping out your gas boiler and working out the cost of an air source heat pump, you probably add up how much it costs for you to do that. Do you need to borrow the money from the bank? Think about that, but in the global economy terms. You're ripping out high carbon parts of the economy and you're replacing it. There's just a simple cost benefit analysis. This is what portfolio managers should be doing if they're looking after your endowment, is running those numbers. Who gets hit first, what gets changed. And the truth is, our balance sheet's strong enough for the huge cost of the replacement of this energy system.
And so I want to move to you, Reverend Spalding, before coming back and sort of hopping around a little bit here. So your career touches on policy, investments, philanthropy, academia, faith. Given all of the different and very important conversations happening in each of these spaces, why are we talking about a just transition, and what does that actually mean?
Thanks so much. In my bio, you'll see that I was also Chief of Staff of the AFL-CIO. So I come from a labor perspective as well. And of course, pensions are labor's deferred wages. And so at the very center of what we're doing, whether we're an endowment or a faith-based organization or a pension fund, we really are concerned about the beneficiaries, the people who matter in our investments. It's their money that we're managing. So I would just start with that as a very central principle. But your question earlier, how does net zero and just transition, or net zero and climate justice, how do those things relate? I want to give you just some really practical answers. If you are on the investment side of the endowment, I think we have some steps we can take together. And it's really necessary that we take these steps together because climate is a risk that hits everything. It's across the economy. It's a systemic risk. So we can't act one company at a time. We can't act one investor at a time. We have to be part of the net zero movement and really begin to address these issues together. For me, putting the people, the workers, and the communities at the center of that conversation is not just the right thing to do, it's the only way we're going to make progress. As many of my colleagues have said, you know, climate justice was built into the Paris Agreement, and if we don't address the workers and the communities, there will be no transition. We can't do it without the people who are involved. So my 4 ideas about how together we can begin to address this. If your endowment or your fund has made a net zero commitment, or whether they're on the path to making a net zero commitment, we need a plan. How are we going to get there? Transition plans are now the buzzword for companies, and we're beginning to track those transition plans, but they must also be the buzzword for investors. Every investor needs a climate action plan. It's how we hold ourselves accountable. And central to that climate action plan has to be just transition. How are we going to move away from the extractive industries? How are we going to reduce carbon? What's going to happen inside those companies? And where are we going to put the new dollars that are going to impact communities on the front line? Those who've been most hurt by climate change need to see the dollars that are going to be part of the solution. So that climate action planning is first. Second, if you hold companies in your portfolio, it's time now to engage those companies around climate change and climate justice. There are lots of initiatives working on this. Climate Action 100 Plus, Nature Action 100 is coming, a new initiative on biodiversity, valuing water, really addressing some of the issues we heard about. Our communities are hurting for clean, good water supply. We have to engage the companies around those issues, and all across it supporting corporate transition plans that put people at the center of the transition. So the third piece, have your ICAPs, your investor climate action plans, engage with the companies in your portfolio. Third, invest in climate solutions. And here, what's the definition of a climate solution? How do we move the money? We have partners in this room. We have fantastic consultants and managers who are real specialists in this. It's not for me good enough to say, we don't have a good definition, we can't do it. There are lots of definitions that are working. What's important is to accelerate the movement of money into the things that are going to establish the low carbon economy and are going to produce good returns for our funds. So emerging markets are a critical place. What we know is that if you use a justice screen, if you use a climate screen in emerging markets, the risk goes down. There are inherent investment risks in emerging markets, currency risk, government risk, but if you actually look at who's addressing climate change and who's looking at it from the perspective of climate justice, you find that the risk is lower. So those can be good investments. The fourth thing that we have to do together is engage our policymakers. The work that we've been doing together with the SEC, trying to improve climate data, getting mandatory reporting on scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, that will help us all. But we also need to engage in the policies that are going to affect the real economy. We're thrilled with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's just one step, and it's here. We've got to move these kinds of policies around the world. Collectively, we can do it. We're here today at Climate Week, talking to people at the UN, aligning with our global partners. You will see many investors going to the COP in Egypt this year. Together we can move at the national level, and then we can really dig deep with the regulators. So those are just 4 big categories, but I'm looking forward to lots more conversation about how the climate justice agenda enables the net zero movement that we all have to be part of to address climate risk.
Thanks so much. And it's always interesting to think about how much of this comes down to being a good investor, fundamentally. So Miguel, staying practical for a second, in your role, you've uncovered a whole lot about engagement, data, and so forth. What works in this department and what doesn't?
No, great question. Thank you for it. It might be helpful to first start by defining engagement. My current working definition of engagement, it is the formal consultation process with multiple strategic touch points across the year to verify a company's alignment with the priority objectives on targeted issues of priority for the investor. Engagement fails when it is not rooted in the pursuit of positive, real-world outcomes. As President Johnson said so eloquently earlier today, in the long term, enhancing value for stakeholders is in direct alignment with enhancing value for shareholders. Similarly, engagement must seek to identify mispriced ESG risk and opportunity sets, as that is what should inform an investment thesis. I'm so happy to hear Reverend Spalding reference engagement, because when it comes to what's working and what's not working in this space, it boils down to effective engagement. I think similarly, what does not work is an investor's reliance on a singular data point, maybe an ESG data provider assessment, to inform their fulsome perspective of a name. And similarly, one-way dialogue does not work in engagement. It is as important for the investor to share their perspective and priorities, expectations of companies regarding the low carbon and just transition. It is equally important to listen to companies, to understand the unique operational contexts, the data challenges that they have, and really get their own assessment of their alignment with different trajectories. It's helpful in engagement to unpack and clarify the gray areas in disclosure that haven't been made fully clear.
And what's the role of banks in this conversation?
Quick change of schedule. We're going to take the rest of the day to address this question. We're just only going to talk about that. The role of the banks. If you speak to different banks and you speak to different stakeholder constituencies, you'll hear various levels of agency ascribed to the banks with respect to their role. One thing is undeniable. The banks are inextricably tied to the transition as the true allocators of capital in the global economy. When I engage with banks on what their role should be, what robust ESG strategy looks like, especially for those earlier on in their journey, I boil it down to three very simple pillars. The first is do more good, do less bad, and do both all the time. So with respect to the low carbon and just transition, doing more good, that means financing mitigation and adaptation technology, evidencing that your deployment of sustainable finance efforts makes meaningful progress against the clean trillion investment gap. It also means expanding access to the unbanked and the underbanked and promoting financial literacy and resilience. The second pillar, do less bad. That is, address the adverse impacts and the risks associated with your operations, your supply chain, and principally with your lending, investment, financing activity. So evidence how your considerations for a client's transition plan and E&S risk profile inform your transaction decision-making, and evidence how your continued relationship with your clients makes progress in these critical areas. Lastly, do both all the time. Ensure the oversight and accountability structures, performance incentives kind of on the governance side, to drive continuous performance improvements in the first two pillars. This is exactly what I like to unpack with banks in engagement.
Thanks so much. And so to finish this off, I have one question I'd like to ask each of the panelists. And I'd like to start with you, again, Reverend Spalding. And that's, is there one thing that folks in this room can commit to doing at their organizations this year, thinking again about the variety of organizations we have represented here, that can be an effective catalyst for climate justice and for net zero at the same time?
One thing is tricky. I would say, you know, the key here is the engagement pillar, I would say, is the real key. Whether you're on the path to making a net zero commitment or have already made a net zero commitment, engaging around communities and the workforce, both with those companies who are transitioning out of the extractive economy and those who are building the low carbon future. So that deep engagement, I think, is the place where we're going to see the change.
My good friends at Influence Map published a report last week that said 60% of the advertising of the fossil fuel majors like Shell and Exxon included green claims like sustainability. But according to the International Energy Agency, less than 5% of the financing from the fossil fuel industry is going to renewables. When we think about engagement, we have to think about what can these companies achieve in reality. In the UK, we had an industrial revolution where we moved from canals to railroads. The shareholders in the canal companies didn't say, let's spend 10 years engaging with the boards of the canal companies to become railway companies. They sold the canal companies and they bought the railroads. The same thing is happening now in the clean energy transition. People are getting out of fossil fuels and forming and investing in the clean economy. This is what portfolio managers should be doing. And if you're an asset owner, make sure you own the right parts of the economy that are growing and are leaving behind the dying parts of the economy, which is the fossil fuel system.
My ask would be to commit to engagement. The reality is these are incredibly important but incredibly difficult challenges to overcome. And each constituency represented in this room and even at this event has a role to play in that transition. Don't be silent in a corner. Commit to engagement, commit to communication, commit to actively seeking to understand those around that might have differing perspectives, and aim to be an inclusive partner in progress moving forward.
I hope people take away from the panel participation that engagement is not necessarily one size fits all. It's certainly not one directional. So I encourage everybody to actively seek out understanding. Understand the perspectives of those who disagree with you and be inclusive in your quest to partner forward towards progress.
Thank you all very much.